My name is Brandon Woodard. I work in Intercultural International Student Services. This event is being co-sponsored by the Mellon Grant, Becoming Community, as well as Intercultural and International Student Services. I'm going to give you a really brief story about how it is that Liam is here today. Instead of a formal introduction, because I think most, if not all of you know who Liam is. Here's the brief story. Last year, as in last academic year, I had a student come into my office. It was probably in the spring semester. He was really struggling, and we just sat and talked, and he cried, and it was good. Life got better for him. This past semester, he happened to come to my office again just to catch up and see how, and so we can talk and see how things are going. And I asked him, you know, because we are having a really deep conversation, I asked him, so who are the men that you could look up to who model the kind of masculinity, the kind of person that you want to be? And he said, nobody. I'm like, oh, okay. I mean, I wasn't looking for a no. But I was like, oh, that's not cool. You've been here for 3 years now. So we continue on with our conversation, and he came back to it, and he said, actually, you know what, there is somebody. Liam. I had Liam in a class, and he was the kind of guy that I want to be when I get older. He's the kind of guy that I want around me right now as a student at St. John. Like, and he said, you know, it'd be so awesome if Liam could come back. And I said, all right. Liam where?
I'm like blushing now, and I have to like pull stuff back together. Thank you all so much for having me back. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I live in Westchester now, outside of Philadelphia, but I truly have missed St. Ben, St. John's, and being here, and the students, and y'all, and the kind of community that y'all create. I will say that I love my new position. I'm in a really robust women's and gender studies department. We have 6 faculty. At a school of 17,000, we have over 100 majors and minors. But I'm not lying when I say it's going to take me 5, 6, 7 years there to build the kind of community that I had here after 1 year. So there's something incredibly unique about this space and the kind of community that you all build. And hopefully I can help us do that even more in my brief time here. And know that whatever conversation we have today, that I'm around, right? Half the people in this space have my cell phone number. You all have my emails. So if there are questions or things that we don't address today, I mean, this is an hour and a little bit. So know that this conversation is ongoing, especially thinking about the needs of our trans and queer students, that there's not sort of a set answer, right? There's not one answer, there's not one approach. And what I say now might be really different in 6 months. So this can be an ongoing conversation. My FYS class, they graduate in May next year, so I'll be back for that. So maybe we can have more conversations then, because I promised them when they finish FYS, I'll give them all certificates that I would buy them a drink, coffee, tea, or otherwise when they graduate. So I have to make good on that promise. So I will be here next year as well. I might have died, which is not totally but I'm so excited to be here with you all and to have this conversation. And so what I want to do is to think about, okay, there we go. I want to kind of get a read on the room. I know some of y'all are super down with terminology and basics. So if I could see just a show of hands, how many of you would feel really comfortable if a student came to you and said, what does it mean to be trans, explaining that? How many of you, by a show of hands, would be, I'm down with explaining that? Most of you. All? Okay, cool. So I want to do a little bit of terminology then and basics. We won't spend a whole bunch of time on that. I want to give you a little bit of background from some studies about what life looks like for our trans and queer students, in particular our trans and non-binary students as they're coming to a place like St. Ben, St. John's, because we have students here, as most of you all know, who are trans, who are non-binary, who are queer. And then really think about your role. Beyond the basic stuff we probably won't get to, but I do want to have everyone leave this space with really concrete things you can do in whatever area you're working at, right? Faculty, staff, student, wherever you're at, I promise there are ways you can do really concrete things to make St. Ben, St. John's not just more inclusive, but literally safer and transformative for the students that are coming who may otherwise not have spaces where they feel affirmed, where they feel comfortable, where they feel celebrated, right? Because I think being lecturing right at the beginning, but then I'm going to have you literally talking to groups to, again, leave with some concrete things. So some terminology and basics. How many of y'all have seen the gender uniform? Party. Okay, so this is going to be real quick. I want us to be able to talk with our students about how the sex we're assigned at birth, the way we understand our gender identity, the way we express our gender, that those things can be separated and that they don't have to match in really normative ways, and actually be able to blast with gender in lots of different ways, right? I was lecturing in Jen Kramer's class a little bit earlier, and a student asked me about a friend of hers who uses they, them pronouns, who identifies as non-binary, and she was asking me about, well, my friend, sometimes they're masculine, sometimes they're feminine, sometimes they're androgynous. I'm like, sweet, that's a blast, right? There are consequences for not following the prescribed rules that we have around gender, as most of us know. But this is a really great way to talk about that, right? So we have gender identity, which is the little rainbow. It's how we see and think of ourselves in terms of how we identify in the world as women, as men, as non-binary, as trans, as any number of genders. Right? Gender expression is the little green dots, sort of how we express our gender, as feminine or as masculine. Right? And that's everything from our mannerisms, from the way we dress to the way we talk. I challenge the students in Jen's class today, particularly the folks who identify as women, for the next 2 days, pay attention to how many times they apologize or say that they're sorry, why they're saying sorry, who they're saying it to. So I challenge everyone in this space, because sometimes I still do that, right? I lived as a woman for 28 years of my life. I'm still unlearning the ways that I was taught to value myself as a woman. Right? So gender expression. We have sex assigned at birth, which is, before we even get to gender identity, is way more complicated than we're taught. We're taught that there's male and female, but there's tons of intersex conditions that folks have. Another thing I ask is, how many of you all know a redhead? Okay, yeah. There are many intersex people in the world as there are redheads. Now, some students hear me say that that means all redheads are intersex. Separate those things. But there are as many intersex people in the world as there are redheads. Not a lot of folks don't know that they're intersex. I've never had my chromosomes tested. Right? I could be intersex. I don't know. And so these things, right? So from here up, the best way I've heard that described is that's who you go to bed as. Right? At the end of the day, how do you understand yourself in the world? And then the bottom two things are who you go to bed with, if you want to go to bed with people at all, right? Who you're sexually attracted to, who you're romantically attracted to. And the other thing, and this will get into some of the practical things I want you to think about, is the specificity of language. So you can see gender identity. There's female, woman, girl, man, male, man, boy. But sex assigned at birth, we just have female and male. Right? And so I like to reserve female, male, intersex for sex assigned at birth. Right? And I like to reserve man, woman, trans, and those other gender identities for how we understand ourselves in the world. And another really great way to explain this to students is, I have a dog. Her name's Maggie. She's real cute and sweet. She's a female dog. It would be really weird if I walked in here and I was like, my dog's a woman. Right? Or if I talked about my dog being a real man. Right? Dogs and animals don't have gender. We have gender. It's something we learn. Right? It's something that all of us learn, regardless if you're trans, regardless if you're cis. Who can tell me what cisgender means when I use that word? Yeah?
Your gender identity matches your sex assigned at birth?
Right, in a normative way, right? So I was assigned female at birth. I do not identify as a woman. I am not cis, right? I am trans. My partner was assigned female at birth. She identifies as a woman. So one way we could talk about her gender is that she is a cis woman, right? That all those things sort of align in a normative way. And that gives us language to talk about trans women and cis women instead of trans women and real women. Because that fundamentally undermines the humanity of trans women. And folks who identify as women who have a trans past, right? Some folks don't even use the language of trans, they just claim women. So that's the gender uniform. This is a really great resource. And again, I'm going to sort of speed through these things so we can get to the more substantive piece. But if you have questions about terminology, you can definitely come back to that. We'll definitely have time for Q&A. So some terminology, just so you have some familiarity. You might see M to F or F to M. That's actually older terminology at this point. But the literature, because the language changes so quickly, a lot of the literature, you'll see some of this language. You might also see transgendered with the ED, right? Even in stuff written by trans people. Susan Stryker, who is a wonderfully famous trans historian, she's at the University of Arizona. She wrote a book called Transgender History, and in the first edition, transgender is all throughout that, right? But this is language that we moved away from. In the same way you wouldn't say that somebody was gayed or straighted, that would be weird, like something happened to them, right? This is an identity, I'm a transgender person, I'm not transgender, right? Something happened to me to make me trans. So the language changes quickly. But the reason I leave this up here for presentations like this is because M to F person, even though that's older terminology, I have trans woman or trans feminine after that. And the reason that's really important is because if folks are moving in a particular direction towards femininity or towards masculinity, we want to acknowledge that. And why I'm saying that is because there are doctors today that would still call me a trans female, right? Which totally undermines my identity as a masculine person in the world. So always wanting to acknowledge if folks are moving towards a particular gender expression or gender identity, which not everyone is, right? Folks who are non-binary don't necessarily want to identify as feminine or masculine, but when folks are, we want to acknowledge that. So gender non-conforming, gender expansive, non-binary, agender, genderqueer. This is language that changes really quickly as well. Non-binary at this point is probably the most common identity I see in students, and this is just a rejection of this binary, like flat out, right? That man-woman doesn't work, I'm out, right? You're always in relationship to those gendered norms and gendered expectations, but this is a way for folks to really challenge the idea that there's only two. And this can be a little bit more difficult because there are women who identify as non-binary, there are trans people who identify as non-binary, there are folks for whom non-binary is their gender. People are encountering this and using this in lots of different ways, but it's a really good term to be familiar with because more and more young folks coming up into college, I think, are using this as a way to sort of reject the idea that they have to be a woman, they have to be a man, they have to embody gender. Any questions thus far? So some terminology to avoid. We did cisgender. Some words y'all probably know to avoid generally. Tranny, transvestite, he, she, it, hermaphrodite. This is the old medical term for intersex. This was the first diagnosis for transness historically. But most folks who would have at some point identified as a transvestite now identify as cross-dressers. The other word that I haven't added up here because I feel complicated about it is transsexual. And I have been told by my students that is now passé, which totally bums me out because I identify as a professional transsexual. That's why I do things like this. So I really like transsexual. It also makes people feel really uncomfortable. I like using that word. But transgender, sometimes you'll see with the asterisk, sometimes you don't. There's lots of conversations in the community of like, do we keep the asterisk, do we not? I don't know. I'm sort of at the age where I can care a little bit less about language, but this is crucially important for the most part for our students. So always taking their lead is key. Real quick about transition, I'm not going to talk about surgeries, I'm not going to talk about hormones, because there's lots of different ways folks transition. Not everyone transitions in the same way, people don't transition at all, right? So there's social transition. The best part about this one is that it's free. It doesn't cost you any money, right? I change my name, I ask you to use a different pronoun, I might come out, I might be out in certain spaces and not in other spaces. But this is a free way of transitioning, which is great. The other things we can do are not free. Legal transition. Name change on birth certificates, IDs, passports, that's really state specific, even county specific. This can cost anywhere from $200 to $600 just to do a legal name change. So this is something that becomes very important that I'm going to want to talk to you all about in terms of name change policy at St. Ben, St. John's. Because the wonderful thing about the systems and the programs that we access, Canvas, PeopleSoft, all the different programs we use, there are ways we can activate things where students can change their names, right? Where when you get a roster, you see the name that they want you to use. Diplomas are not legally binding contracts. We can put whatever name we want on those, so do students have access to thinking about how do they get their name changed on that stuff? Because that's the difference, too, between being trans and non-binary and being gay, and that when you're gay, most often you don't change your name. And when you're trans, a lot of times you do, and those records follow you, right? I had to use my transcripts or something a couple years ago, right? My undergrad transcripts still have my own name on them, right? And if I wasn't out, that could be actually quite dangerous for me. I could lose jobs over it, I could be denied jobs over it, right? So thinking about the way the legal paper trail of our gender, our sex markers, our legal names follow us in really intense ways, in ways that most of us probably don't think about. The last way is medical stuff, hormones, gender-affirming surgeries. The way we're talking about gender-affirming surgeries nowadays is GAS most often. You might see older terminology, SRS, sex reassignment surgery. That's older terminology, so generally we talk about gender-affirming surgeries. There is not one surgery, there's lots of different kinds of surgeries, right? I always tell my students when people ask me if I've had the surgery, I said, yes, I had my wisdom teeth out in high school, and it was the worst. My cheeks puffed up, I have like bruises. It's not cute. But this is something that some folks access, other folks don't. There's a whole smorgasbord of things you can access in terms of medical intervention. It is my understanding that in St. Cloud, there is now a clinic that supports trans health. Right, when I was here 3 years ago, no doctor in St. Cloud would see me. Right, I had to go to the cities, which I had access to do, which is awesome. Right? A lot of folks don't have that kind of access. So I'm really glad that there's a clinic here. But that's another thing to think about, right? If you have any affiliation with health services or counseling services on campus, what are some ways we can think about supporting students for these kinds of things? Because none of this stuff is settled, right? So to legally change your name or your gender marker, quite often you have to have a letter from a doctor. But how do you find a trans-affirming doctor? I've also had doctors refuse to write me letters, which I'm like, I already look like this. Like, why are you nervous about this? But they would refuse to support me in those ways. So that's sort of planting little seeds like that. And not everyone chooses or is able to transition. Again, this stuff is very cost prohibitive, but there's no right way to be trans. I think that's one thing I always also try and tell folks, that as many trans people as there are in the world, there's that many narratives of how to be trans, right? I don't feel like I was born this way. This is something I came into in my late 20s, early 30s, and I would choose this any day of the week. And I also understand that the choice narrative is complicated. People feel some sort of way about that. But I think if we aren't engaging in the nuance of those conversations, we're doing our students a disservice, right? The same way that I've realized, and I'm actually interested in hearing this from y'all. I've noticed in the past several years, maybe it's a Pennsylvania thing, where my students are coming to me from high school, having been taught that saying the word gay is bad and that they should say homosexual. Has that been y'all's experience? Okay, that's good. What I've found is that I get so many students from high school whose teachers refuse to engage in a nuanced conversation around when you can say gay and when you can't. Right? Calling a chair gay is not cool. Using gay as someone's identity, thumbs up. Do not call me a homosexual. Right? The first thing that tells me is that you don't have any gay friends. Because it's old terminology, right? It is terminology that's very clinical, that most gay folks are like, I'm not really down with you calling me homosexual. I don't take offense to it, right? I think it comes with good intentions. But it does reveal to me a lot about how embedded you are in queer community. Okay, a few things about discrimination, and then we're going to talk about some concrete stuff. So there's two specific studies that focus on trans students, and there's actually a newer one that I don't know that I saw literally like a few days ago. So once I find that, I can get that to y'all. But these are both available as PDFs online. So experiences of transgender youth in our nation's schools, harsh realities from 2009. This is one of the only studies that focus explicitly on trans students. And then this one is more inclusive in terms of identity, but it focuses on rural and small town schools, which is particularly relevant, I think, to a lot of the demographic of students who are here. And what we found is that students are experiencing outrageous amounts of harassment, and not just from other students, but from faculty, from staff, from administrators. Verbal harassment is outrageously high, physical harassment, sexual harassment, and of course these realities are compounded by race, class, disability. When we've seen the statistics, hopefully you've seen some of them from the Southern Poverty Law Center about the rise in hate crimes and acts of violence, particularly around race and immigration status and perceived immigration status, perceived religious beliefs, where all of this is compounded by that, right? Where students are experiencing extremely high rates of violence in our schools. And paired with that, they're not able to find any good information about themselves. Right? There's nothing positive in the library. There's nothing positive in their schools. There's nothing positive in the faculty and staff that are reflecting who they are. Very few students have an inclusive curriculum. I mean, I imagine most of you know sort of the reality of sex ed in high schools at this point, right? Only is it 80% of curriculums aren't required to have medically accurate information? Like, it's horrifying. There's a report called the Waxman Report. Only 4 states and DC are required to include anything around queer identity in sex ed. And this stuff directly affects students feeling safe, right? 75% of trans students don't feel safe in high school. 16% of these students drop out of high school because of these realities, right? So this is an incredible opportunity for us at institutions like this, where it's the first time for many students they have a safe place to live, right? Where they feel like they can reach out to folks and say, hey, I'm queer, hey, I'm trans, I need some resources. And we have an incredible opportunity, I think, obligation to our students to recognize the power that we have to provide this space for them. All right, so I want to think about, sorry, I didn't change that. We can make safe ends more safe and affirming for trans and gender non-conforming individuals, and how we can work in solidarity. And I'm using this language in particular, working in solidarity, because I think we talk a lot about being allies, or what's the new word, accomplices, right? And it's this identity we take on. Like, I'm an ally, cool. Well, that doesn't require me, right? But if you are working in solidarity, and I want to give credit where credit's due, this is language from Mia McKenzie. And she is a queer black writer, feminist, who writes a blog called Black Girl Dangerous that's vying for queer and trans people of color to be folks. And she talks about this on one of her blog posts, where she's like done with the ally language, right? Because this requires us to do community work. Because I also don't think, for example, if I'm doing anti-racism work, that as a white person, I don't get to call myself an ally, right? I don't get to determine when my work is good enough or supportive enough, or if I'm doing the right things. Like, folks of color get to say that to me, but I don't get to play an ally, right? And I think it's true with trans and queer stuff, with disability, with all of these things, that I can work in solidarity with you, but I don't get to determine when my work is good enough, right? So thinking about how we can work in solidarity with trans and queer folk. So what I would love us to do actually at your tables, because I think it would take too long, because I want to hear from all of y'all. But if you would go around your tables, and I think most folks know each other, but share, if you don't know your names, do names, but share where you work, like what institution or unit you work at on campus. And I want you to think, and we can talk about this in a group, but what are ways that your office is really inclusive of trans and non-binary folks? Right? And if you can't name some of those, then we'll talk about that as well. So if you could do that at your tables. So hopefully that was interesting. How many of you heard something that somebody else is doing that you never thought or occurred to you to do in your own space? A few, okay. Because this is partly too, right, using each other as resources for different ideas, right? Because again, I can be here for a minute, but what are ways that your colleagues are thinking in really innovative ways in terms of supporting students on this campus? So I would love to hear from you all, ways in your unit, if you would share where you work, what you do, and ways that y'all are being inclusive. Because I know there are things that y'all are doing, right? I want to start on a good note, because St. Vincent John's is doing some good work. Yeah.
Yes. I think the obvious one that I can just throw out to get us started is pronouns, and including them on your emails and some of those pieces, and posting that even outside your door. And when you're starting your class at the beginning of the semester, asking students to introduce themselves with these pronouns.
So let's talk about that for a second. So you all get rosters of students, right? And I think a lot of folks call rosters on the first day. Why might that be not the best way to go? Or if you have a meeting with a student in your office and even the name on their email comes up and you call them by their name right when they come in. Why might that be not great or even dangerous sometimes? Yeah?
Be a trigger for someone who has a separate identity that corresponds with their name that's in the banner.
So it can be triggering for them, right, if the name isn't on banner. Why might that also be dangerous or not great in a classroom? Yeah?
Other students might not identify them, or they might identify themselves to other students and you just outed them by a different.
Right, you totally just outed them, right? So many trans people or non-binary folks are totally not cool with their old legal name, right? And in fact, in the community, we call it dead naming, right? If you were to use Caitlyn Jenner's old name, you're dead naming her, right? That's not a name that's affirming to her. And that you can experience that in fairly traumatic ways. For me, I actually really like, well, I never liked my old name. I think it's sort of funny because it totally didn't fit, right? But if I'm in a classroom and I'm I'm going to use my own name. And I'm in a class, Brandon's teaching it, and he calls the roster, and he calls out Brittany Boswell. Right? Ooh, that's rough for me, right? If I don't want to be out, because that is such a gender name. Sometimes you can kind of get by with it if it's like a gender inclusive name, but most often that can be really dangerous and unaffirming and triggering, right? So checking in with names, checking in with pronouns, right? What other ways did anyone talk about gender inclusive language beyond just calling roll or on emails? What other ways can we be inclusive about language? And specifically, if you have ideas in the unit. What are other ways we can do that? Yeah.
I work in residence life, and I
Okay.
supervise student staff members, and I work with mine a lot on sending their emails and not greeting their residents as, hey ladies, hey girls, we're gonna have this event, and be more inclusive in that language.
Brilliant, right? So ladies and gentlemen, hey ladies. I even think we use sort of, and I have to work on this, like, hey guys, right? That is not inclusive language, right? And that's something really concrete you can do in any unit that you're in, right? Whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in student services or financial aid, thinking about the language we use when we're addressing groups can be really exclusive in intense ways, right? Other ideas? So I would be interested in hearing y'all's reaction, and I think, I mean, you don't have to answer it, I think it could be rhetorical. But if I left this space right now, and I walked out on campus, and I walked up to a random guy, and I said, hey, do you have a boyfriend? How would that conversation go? Probably not very well. Not cute, right? So I asked this, right, and I bring this up for two reasons. One, to think about the own assumptions we're making when we walk in spaces, and then how that is then reflected in our language, right? We're, I think, really comfortable asking folks to be perceived as women. Oh, do you have a boyfriend? Are you dating him? Right? Or asking someone we perceive as a guy. Oh, are you dating her? Is she your girlfriend? Are you hoping to get married? Right? All of this, all of the ways we talk to people in these sort of social interactions are very revealing of the assumptions that we operate on, right? I just sort of assume everyone's gay. I think that's a lot more fun. But I think it's also interesting that for many of my students, that would make them really uncomfortable. And I have to ask them why, right? Because I don't actually think they're all gay. But if I tell them that and they start to kind of get uneasy, right? How is that reflective of maybe they're really cool with gay people, but what is the disconnect between them being cool with other folks and them being associated with queerness in any capacity, particularly young men, right? In ways that masculinity becomes synonymous with heterosexuality, which becomes synonymous with anything not feminine. So that's the language piece too, right? How many of you work in units, financial aid or otherwise, where people have to fill out forms of some capacity? What do those forms look like? I'd be interested in hearing. Like, what are the things that they have to write down? Yeah.
I work for the Collegeville Institute, and we have to buy people's flight tickets to get here, and that one has been tough. So we went away from just having M or F, but then to buy a flight ticket, that's
Got it.
yeah. We're still trying to figure out what to do.
Okay, right. But is there a conversation with folks that you're in touch with about what are your pronouns, how do you identify, and then what's your legal?
Just in the last year, yeah, we've started having that conversation as a staff, and then changing the ways that we do
Okay.
put that on our forms.
Cool. Yeah, because there's also, like, as a trans person, like, that's real. Like, I know I need to put F on my stuff, right? Because I'm legally female. So there's also a way that I think, too, I think it's great that you're having these conversations, because sometimes there's ways we tiptoe around the conversations, like, we don't want to offend them, we don't want to talk to them. But as trans people, like, we know we got to do this stuff. I know if someone's buying me a ticket, they need to know my legal sex, right? But how do we better have these conversations? And it gets way easier and better with practice and trial and error, right? Because I'm trans, and do I mess up with trans stuff? Yeah, right? I mean, no one's perfect, right? We've internalized all of this stuff around gender, around race, around all this stuff, but this is an ongoing project. So other folks where you have forms to fill out. Any other folks, what do your forms look like? Do you have to put gender? Are there spaces for a name? What do some of those forms look like? Yeah?
Counseling and health, both our counseling and health forms, we leave it open-ended instead of making them big box.
Okay.
So they can choose to self-describe.
In terms of gender.
Yep.
Does it say gender or does it say sex?
Well, good question. I don't know. I think it says gender.
Cool. great way of doing it, right? Some folks have just added boxes, and I always have to write like a paragraph, because there's no box for me, like, right? But it's also interesting to think about when we ask about gender or sex, and I know sometimes there is reporting that we have to do, or we're supposed to collect information in particular ways, but are there forms where we don't even need gender, right? So thinking and challenging you all to go back to your spaces and like, what do these forms look like? If you need someone's legal name, do you really need their legal first name, or you just need their legal last name, right? And so on forms that I create, I actually separate those out. Legal last name, first name, right? Legal or not. Because I don't need to know their legal first name, right? If it's in Banner, if it's somewhere else, I can find that out. But thinking about how little things like that, right, reflect who's welcome in these spaces, and how transformative it has been for me to go into a space and like, I'm on the forum, right? Like it's these little things, like I went to Family Tree, which is the queer clinic in Minneapolis, and it's so wonderful to sit down and not have to write extra stuff. Like there's boxes for me. And it seems so trivial, but it's so not, right? Because day in, day out, our students are not experiencing those spaces, right? Other best practices that you all talked about. So we talked a little bit about language. What are some other best practices that you all have in your units and divisions? Is units the right name? Divisions, spaces? Cool. Check it out. Yeah?
How about inclusive bathrooms?
Okay. Is that, so I heard some folks talk about in the library, because there's a new, I mean, that's new, right? So what has St. Ben St. John's been doing around bathrooms? Because I've been gone for 2 years, so y'all tell me what's been happening. Yes.
So I know all new buildings, we have unisex or family bathrooms.
Okay.
I think we're really actually trying to push for family restrooms in each of the buildings, but it hasn't really gone far yet.
Okay.
At least at St. John's.
Okay. So there are spaces now that are inclusive. Yeah.
The language though still seems to be a little different.
Okay.
You know, family bathroom, that's fine, but you don't see signage that says, like at other college campuses, Paul Decker or multi-sex or however you want to, you know, be clear about that with your text.
Yeah, signage is huge. I'm always fascinated by the multi-sex, like I have lots of sexes at once. Right, or unisex, just one. It is a step in the right direction, right? But it is interesting when we do create single stall, gender inclusive bathrooms, and it's still a little dude and a little woman and a chair, right? And there's so many cool signs. I saw a sign that had the print symbol. I'm like, that's a great bathroom sign. I don't know, right? That we can be inventive and have fun with this. And I also recognize that there are limitations, right? That there are negotiations with folks that may not be as open to the conversation that we're having in this space. But what's interesting about bathroom signs is most time, if you just do it, people don't notice. And this is another place where we can think about ways to work intersectionally, right? Because what's so interesting about institutions and built spaces is it's so revealing of who is at the table when those spaces were built, who those spaces were built for, and who they're meant to invite in, right? And this isn't just around trans stuff, right? This is around accessibility, disability stuff, right? Because you can have gender inclusive housing, but if that gender inclusive housing isn't also accessible to folks who are chair users or have physical disabilities, is it really accessible, right? I mean, I can talk to, this is actually a great question. If you're coming to my keynote, you can't tell the answer. What year did women in the House of Representatives get their own bathroom? 2001. Right? Women in the Senate, 1993. Big one, right? And so there's this really interesting history where bathrooms reflect so many interesting things about our culture and the way, I mean, not just transphobia and sexism, but racism and white supremacy work, that bathrooms are incredibly reflective of who's supposed to be in these spaces, right? I have grad faculty when I was in grad school who were doing archival work, and there was no women's restroom in the archives. It was a space meant for men only, right? And the ways we police gender and race is really interesting and devastating, right? So thinking about not only do we have these restrooms, but what does the signage look like? What does the language look like? Is it reflective of who we want and to invite in these spaces? Are they in the corner, hidden away, or are they super accessible? Other best practices. I heard y'all talk about some really cool stuff. I'm just gonna stare at y'all. teacher on cool salads.
I like where we, in a lot of new spaces, and you're really instrumental in helping us get there with just the partitions in the back. We're gonna have bathrooms. I love the partitions that go to the ground.
Oh.
And I love when they're over this big space that they've been replaced and so it becomes a private space. And I think we now have enough spaces for our 230 student athletes and another 250 club athletes. Should you want to shower, you can choose to do whatever it is you need to do for yourself privately. And then to have some other spaces too, if someone needs a separation, they can get that too.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting there in interesting ways.
Totally. Well, that was so cool to work with you, right? Because we were thinking about locker rooms and like retrofitting spaces to be inclusive. And there's like companies that make stuff that retrofit these spaces to be inclusive, right? Because when I got here, there were no locker rooms I could use, right? As the only, at least that I know, out trans faculty at the time. I wouldn't say that I'm the first because we don't know who's trans, right? But there was not a place for me and for students to use, right? And until you have those bodies and those spaces here, right, you probably don't think about that as much. So it's also being in conversation with trans students and creating spaces for them to say, like, I can't actually access a locker room, I can't access this space, or I need some help here, or whatever, right? So part of it is also being in conversation, creating those spaces for those conversations. I also heard you talking about like visible markers, right? Like you were talking about that like, in the door. What were you saying?
I have just a lot of signage around my desk in the physical plan.
Like what kind of signage?
Everyone is welcome here. I know I have the first year student one.
Yeah, cool.
A few others.
Okay.
I don't know what's all out there right now. I know Becoming Community is up there.
Okay. And that can be really transformative, right? For students to see a rainbow or to see a trans flag or to see a first gen sticker on a door. But then also with that, right, doing your own work around that, right? And ongoing work, right? Some, I think, of the most damaging conversations I've seen students have is actually with LGBT faculty who came out 30 years ago and they're like, I got it, I'm good, I know all this stuff. And they're like, there are 5 genders. Oh, there's actually way more than 5. And you saying that is revealing how much you haven't kept up with what's new, right? So putting these visible markers, but then knowing where your resources are. And there are so many incredible resources online at this point, right? Listen is a great space. They're the folks who hosted or that did the studies. It's the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. TSER is the Trans Student Education Resource, TSER. They're the ones who did the gender unicorn. They also have wonderful infographics generally. So doing your own work around here, what is the terminology, following your students' lead on that stuff, but making sure that if you're going to avail yourself to students or make yourself available to students and put that signage on your doors, you're also doing some work around what that means. And then following through in your particular divisions, right? Because I think that's also one of the things I would really encourage you all to do and to think about, and we'll break up in a second to talk about specifics in your own spaces, is once you leave this space today, what are 1 or 2 really concrete things you can do in your division, right? Because we have an admission policy here, right, at St. Vincent St. John's, for trans inclusion. But to my knowledge, there's no explicit policy telling students that they can use whatever bathroom is affirmed to them. Am I right on that? So I think that's right, right? So how do we put things like that in place? Because I think waiting for incidents to happen because they will is a detriment. It does a disservice to our students, right? How many of you are faculty advisors to groups on campus? Like, what are some of the groups that y'all advise? Yeah. Which one? Okay. All of them. Brandon does all of them. Amanda, which one are you?
Active Minds and SciPac.
Okay. Other groups? Yeah.
The Student Bass Fishing Club.
Brilliant. That's like specific kind of fishing. I learned a lot of things I didn't know before I came to this thing, right?
We have a student, a potential student who is very, very interested in coming here because of that club.
I support that. They're a big. That's big. Okay, like I have 0 idea. It's like you're talking about sports and like the outfits are cute. I don't know. Right, but all of you are probably involved in some capacity with student groups, athletics, whatever it might be, right? what are the policies or what are the statements about who can join those groups? And are they inclusive, right? Just like when you talk to students like, do you have a boyfriend, do you have a girlfriend, how are you perpetuating particular expectations by not saying anything, right? Or by not being explicit in your inclusion, right? And that's one of the things I also talk to my students about is that, you know, we're socialized in particular ways to whiteness, to straightness, to all of these things, and that we learn just as much by what we're taught, by what we're not taught, right? By the silence around the language that we use, right? And that's something I've been really challenged on, right? I do a sex ed trivia in my Intro to Women's and Gender Studies class, and I realized that I had some questions that involved queer stuff and involved some trans stuff, but I had a lot of questions that were, well, women and men. Well, why am I not saying cis women? Why am I not saying cis men? Why am I not being more inclusive in like how I'm conceiving of the word woman, right? And again, as a trans person, I looked at that and was like, oh my God, this is so exclusive in my mind, right? How do I think through, even when I'm not talking about trans stuff, right, trans-specific content, how is my language reflecting me being inclusive or exclusive, right? And that's one way where even if you're teaching math or something that you see as disconnected from trans identity, how in our language or in our examples, right? Because I feel like I remember like the train goes here, train A and train B, right? I think those are math things. There's lots of letters. I don't know. But there are examples, right? And how can we even challenge the norm around the examples we use? Because I think our go-to is like a man and a woman, right? Or something about straightness. And so how can we even change the examples we use to model for our students the language that we want them to carry? I think one of my greatest accomplishments was I was teaching Intro to Women's Gender Studies, and I had this super femme sorority woman, and by the end of the semester, she was using the word cis as if it was nothing. And I was like, oh my God, this is like the best day of my life. That was just language that flowed out of her without any second thought, right? And paying attention to the way when we name transness and we don't name cisness, right? And I think that there are parallels to the way we name race but not name whiteness, right? So how can we be thorough in the way we're thinking about our language and how we're talking about this, right? And I think that this can be challenging even to other faculty, other staff, alumni, folks from outside of this campus, when we talk about partners, right? Not do you have a wife, do you have a husband, do you have a partner? And I know some queer folks feel complicated about that, but I would much rather be inclusive and then have a conversation about why I'm using that than automatically assume that every single person I encounter is straight, right? So I'll give you all a few specific things that I wanted to bring up. So part of this, right, is always doing your own work. And this involves thinking about the way we can depathologize transness. Because again, I think there's this way where I'm expected to have a coming out narrative, and I do, right? I'm a professional transsexual, so of course I do. Right, but I'm expected to come out and straight folks aren't, and cis people aren't, right? Even though we all have narratives around our gender and how we learn our gender. So thinking about why some people's choices and transitions are seen as a normal part of life, and others are seen as a psychological condition, right? And there's a lot of anxiety around the diagnoses and what that means. And some students will want a diagnosis, right? They want to use gender dysphoria, and it gives them empowerment to claim an identity. For me, I really struggle with that, because I think being in the DSM is problematic, but it also gives us access because of insurance, and it's complicated, right? So, space for nuance. Thinking about hormones, right? Like my insurance sort of covers my testosterone, but if I was a cis dude, they would cover it no problem. Like, why is that so weird? Why do we pathologize some folks getting breast augmentation, right? They're like messed up. But other folks can like start a fundraiser and they have like $5,000 20 minutes later, right? So why are some things on certain bodies pathologized and others not? So questions like that, right? And thinking about specifically, oh, this is the one. How gender rules and norms, ideas about what men and women, and particularly cis men and cis women, but broadly defined men and women, should be like. How is this enforced in your life? And what does it mean to push back against these rules and norms? So actually, really quickly, we have end at 1:30, 20 more minutes? Sure, I'll do this. So I would love to ask you all, what are the ways you see this in your life, right? Because I imagine, even if you can't think of a personal experience, most of you interact with young children in some capacity. So like, what are some of the ways you've seen people policing gender? Yeah.
When we announce or celebrate someone's engagement,
Yeah.
here trying to teach staff that certain conversations where someone is dating
interesting, right? Like our celebration of heterosexual marriage or marriage broadly it's like this entryway into adulthood that you don't really have access to unless you're married, right? Even the language we have, like husband and wife are like adult words. Like it's weird if you're like 45 and like the girlfriend, which is also infantilizing. Like it's weird, right? Like you do this. So yeah, celebrating different ways of. Yeah.
I mean, this gender. I have a 3-year-old and a 4-month-old, so gender reveal parties.
Ooh.
And so. And not only that, but choosing how to dress your child. So, we have a boy and a girl,
Right.
and choose against 3 against socializing and they can
Right.
you're a boy, you're a girl. So.
Yeah.
But but just kind of challenging those notions in small ways. Sometimes we don't put anything in her hair, whatever she decides to do, that's the thing, right? But and talk to other people, other parents about the same, our decisions to do that.
Yeah, I want gender reveal with just glitter.
I wouldn't want to be just Jerry's just yellow.
Right? But so I think this is the kid stuff is super intense, right? I actually had a student ask me earlier in class. He was like, "Do you think it's too much to talk to kids about gender, to talk about sexuality? Like, is that burdening them?" And the burden is already on them, right? We've seen kids police each other and shame each other for playing with their own toys when they're 4, when they're 5, right? That we're burdening them by not talking about this stuff. And when we look at rates of death by suicide for trans kids or attempts, right, or depression, psychiatric stuff happening because there is no space for them, right? The onus is on us because we haven't created those spaces, right? Man up. Don't be a pussy. And all of that is also connected to masculinity in the ways we demonize and scrutinize femininity, or the worst thing we can call a boy is a girl. Which I think is, again, very revealing. But yeah, the toys, the clothes, not letting kids play with it. Like Barbie dolls are dolls. I mean, He-Man, G.I. Joe, they're dolls. They're dolls, yeah.
Nail polish with their son.
Yes.
and like a lot of kids at school were doing it. And in a small town like came out of me, it was kind of cool to see that it wasn't something that was shamed.
Yeah.
So it was like all of a sudden there were 5 or 6 kids that were
Right.
toys for doing it.
Right. Yeah.
So I have a partner, and she has a pink purse. And sometimes when she goes to the restroom or to try on clothes and stuff like that, I get the pink purse. Instead of holding the pink purse like many men do, which is I'm distance to me.
Right.
I actually put it on my shoulder.
Cute. It's way more comfortable.
Makes it right. But I also recognize that people are giving me looks and making all kinds of jokes. Like, yeah, this is mine. I like it. It goes with my eye.
I can see that. Pretty cute. But so I think, right, even thinking about, I mean, we can talk about, and I want to talk about institutional stuff, but those small interactions can be hugely transformative, and I think the ways, trying to do the work of recognizing the ways that we have all been socialized and that we've all internalized these gendered expectations is really hard work, right? And I'm fairly comfortable, even as a queer person, as a trans person, with painting my nails, piercing my ears, but there are things that I'm still uncomfortable doing. As someone who's perceived as masculine, I'll be feminine to a certain extent, right? So even I'm still working through that stuff. I'm still working through the way I use language, right? Y'all has been very helpful for me, and I make fun of that, but it's super inclusive. But I still say guys sometimes. But the ways, I think, in those moments of discomfort, not saying you're uncomfortable, like if you are uncomfortable holding a purse and you're a guy, where does that come from? Like sort of digging that out, right? If someone were to call you a trans person or call you gay, you feel a little bit like, sort of sitting with that. What is it about that that you feel anxious about? Because there are real reasons to be anxious about that, right? And not just verbal harassment, physical and violent harassment, right? I mean, a guy in Texas 15 years ago, he was beat to death because he was holding his girlfriend's purse. Straight to him, right? But people are so threatened by that, in particular femininity on masculine bodies. So really digging that out for our own selves, right? Okay, so I want to leave time for y'all to talk. There are a few things that I just want to highlight, right? So names and pronouns I think are huge, right? So including pronouns on your signature. I have actually, and I can send it to Brandon to send out to all of y'all, I actually actually have my pronouns, and then I have a link that talks about rosters and calling names and what are good ways of doing that and why it's important to do that. But also being flexible, right? Because if you start to create these spaces where trans students are comfortable talking to you, you might have students want you to use a name that they feel good about, but only in that space, because they aren't comfortable being out otherwise. So really being intentional and flexible about offering that to them, right? Because I also have students who come to me and they're like, well, I don't want to burden, right? Because I think that's the first thing we do as folks that have been historically marginalized is we feel like a burden. So being very clear that you are not the burden, and I'm more than happy to do this, because this is really exciting, right? Because you might be the only person who's telling them this is awesome. And so being flexible with pronouns and names, depending on where and when they want to use them, right? So flexibility in that. Also flexibility with just terminology and stuff changes, right? Community, knowing and having in-hand resources for students. Right? The library is a great place for this, but there are tons of online resources. What books do you know of? If a student came to you and said, I need to talk to my family, do you know of a book you could recommend to them? Right? There are zines, there are really incredible resources, and again, I can share a list of resources with Brandon, and he can email it out to y'all, because having those things on hand can be incredibly transformative. And there's actually a new book out by SUNY Press. Jenny Beeman is one of the editors. What is it called? Trans People in Higher Education. It's a brand new book. It's available on Amazon. It's also available via SUNY Press. The first half is stuff written by trans faculty, staff, and students. And the second half is policy and research and ways to really change our institutions and transform things. So thinking again about institutional change, and this is beyond the actual spaces, although that's incredibly important. But what is your curriculum about, right? Whose voices are you including? Because trans folks, we're everywhere, right? In every field, in every discipline. How are you including those voices? How are you including, again, roll call, right? If you share something about yourself at the beginning of the class, like I come out as trans to my students for various reasons. But if you introduce yourself and you say, you know, I'm married, this and that, are you also saying, well, I'm straight? Like, what identities are you naming and what identities are you not naming? Right? Because we don't name generally the identities that are the dominant, right? Are you naming that you're white? Are you naming that you're straight? Are you naming that you're cis? Because by doing those things also reveals to the students that you're aware of, that terminology, but that you also have that identity, right? Again, terminology, flexibility, like non-binary was not a thing when I came out. It's a thing now. 5 years from now, it might be something different. So being, again, continually invested in learning how terminology changes. Recognizing how sexuality and gender are separate, but also that they aren't. Right? So again, who you go to bed as, and who you go to bed with, but those things aren't unrelated, right? And the way we talk about those things aren't unrelated. Right? I often ask, like, so I'm legally female, look like a dude. If I were to marry Tom Cruise, who's a cis guy, are we straight or are we gay? Right? The language we have for sexuality, once you start pulling apart gender, sex, and sexuality and gender expression, the language we have for that stuff sort of stops working, right? Now I would just call that super gay. You're really gay. But recognizing that these things are related, right? And that a lot of folks, when they begin to identify as trans, their sexuality might change, right? And giving them space for that, and giving them permission for that. Thinking about your interactions and your conversations, right? How you introduce yourself, are you asking for people's pronouns? Are you asking them if they have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or if they have a partner, or why is that even an expectation, right? Because there's lots of folks on campus who are asexual. They're not interested in dating, right? Or maybe they're aromantic. So how is your knowledge base reflected in the conversations that you're having? And then just generally inclusive language, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, men and women, instead of hey, people of all genders. There's lots of different ways to do that. So, what I would love for you all to do at your table, since we only have 11 minutes, so let's take 8 minutes because I want to hear some of the concrete things. So we've talked about some really concrete ways to think about doing some of this stuff, but y'all are experts in your own areas in ways that I have no knowledge of. So I would love for you all just to take some time either sharing with each other or writing down a few things, like 1 or 2 concrete things you can do in your units, whether it's looking at forms, whether it's putting up signage, whether it's learning more, right? If it's an individual thing, if it's a structural thing, if it's an institutional thing, what are some of those things you can do in the areas where you are? Cool.
but also sometimes hear the names. I'm a specialist. That's why. Maybe the syllabus directly or especially for
But that can be good, you know, person gets an email, they notice it. They may not say anything, but it might mean a lot.
Just figure this out and do all the talking. Right. Because that's the way, right? Yeah.
And then as things change, the changes language changes. Our need to know these.
Right.
Like how often do we ask this just as you're trying to ask really?
As far as the
It doesn't matter.
at least at St. John's.
You know, if we identify as female or non-binary. Over the course of discussions in my class,
I get frustrated at that.
or my age.
This school is about this. Like, oh, no, it's not what it is.
Of the social capital that
You know, to be, you know, this.
and
So you can just,
here.
just get frustrated. I think
I just did not see it coming, and I really should have views on the same in ways I did not understand. It's like silly there, that's good enough. Like Greg, I just didn't get it. And I saw it in a whole play. So that experience makes me people see things differently. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. So that's great. Yeah, right, yeah. Right. Is there better? I know everyone's marriage. Which I think that's but I don't think that's I mean, it still doesn't function. And also it's for efforts. And it's only two people, right? I mean, so, you know, a lot of the people that are amorous, so yeah.
And I think the requirement is, because I used to, I think that requirement is, so I make it, it's great for the students. Because for some students, they think they're all students, right? And they kind of want to
How did you even approach this? Like, I've had
You know, one way in that I found on accident was talking about intersex. The category of intersex really opened up a space for gender spectrum conversations in ways that I thought was really helpful.
Yeah, I never heard that term intersex before. That is like an it is a mind-boggling. I mean, I remember that I listened to her the first time I ever realized it is a way. These are physical things. So therefore, there are other things.
And
I know it's a little bit early, but I'd love to have just a few minutes. So I want to touch on some things that I've overheard. So what are some of the concrete ideas that y'all are going to do leaving this space? Yeah.
I'll start off with this one. Harlan, our colleague over there, has identified pronouns and a hyperlink that says, what is this? You click on the hyperlink and it takes you to Duke University, which is a great place. But it's not us. So one of the things that I say is that I'm going to go ahead and see if I can create that information for St. Vincent St. John so that people click on that link.
Yeah. I'll also link to that. I am suffering. I try and do this. Cool. Awesome. Other folks? Yeah.
We're revising our mission statement in mathematics, and we say that we want to serve all students, that we want maybe strengthen the language to include like all backgrounds, all that, and really make it clear what we mean by all.
Really?
And then of course, hopefully follow through and actually use it.
Yeah. And that's the hard part. Sarah Ahmed talks about the way sometimes diversity statements are then used as evidence of the work of diversity without actually doing anything, right? But I think that there is something that those statements can do that they can just account. Brilliant. Other folks? Yeah.
I work in alumni relations, and we're working with the St. John's Academy and alumni developing an affinity group for the LGBTQ community. So that's something we're really excited about launching, see what interest is out there, so we can do more inclusive programming, and also probably helping make that connection back to students who are on campus.
Right.
Support networks and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's huge, right? To connect with those folks, to hopefully show that some of the experiences they may have had that were not so great. Although that's nice also. But I think that's such important work. Other. Well, two things I want to bring up real quick. One sort of questions for y'all. Jean Keller was talking about pronouns, and maybe I should have made this a little bit clearer. I think asking for folks' pronouns are really important, but I think giving them the option is also crucially important. I used to call my roster at the beginning of class, well, I wouldn't call, I would just have people introduce themselves and say, please give me your name and your pronoun. And some folks aren't comfortable giving their pronouns, or they don't know what I'm asking. So I make it optional. Your name and your pronoun if you feel like sharing. To give folks an out, because if they aren't quite comfortable yet, I think that's an important thing, an important piece. But the other thing I overheard was, how do we, so I imagine I'm familiar with most of the folks in this space because y'all are always the folks in these spaces, right? So then what? Like, what do we do about that? Do y'all have ideas? So if I had the answer for that, I'd probably be a different fancy job. I mean, y'all know this place way better. I'm super here. How do we get those folks to buy in? Yeah.
Oh, I'm a social psychologist.
Cool.
We would say you just change the environment. And people will come along. We can't wait for people to change. You guys just do it. And
Right. So what does that mean to change the environment? Like, what would that look like from a social psychology perspective?
I think it would be having an LGBT plus center, it would be having more speakers, it would be making the issue relevant and important on campus.
Okay.
And then it would change it.
And holding people accountable, right? If they aren't using students' names and pronouns, how are we holding the faculty and staff accountable for the kind of trauma that comes to students? Yeah.
And if we had a chief diversity officer, and with an office, then this would be a way, like we were talking about the forms thing.
Yeah.
Instead of every department having to go through and make their forms more inclusive, if we had a template from the diversity office that gave us guidelines and updated them as the language changes, that I think would also make things more visible, but it would provide the level of institutional change that you're also pointing to, right? That it needs to be up here and not necessarily just with.
Yeah. And then maybe it's even talking to students about asking for some empowerment to require those things in the institution. Yeah.
I think sometimes we forget that students sometimes that we aren't as transparent as other students. That we forget that they don't read their emails. I think as I'm not faculty.
Totally.
I think that with faculty, I would advise to find innovative ways to be as transparent as possible with students, because a lot of times they don't know what's going on. They don't know that the mission statement is being changed. They don't know that you're doing these new things. They think that St. John's has been the same way for the last 4 years. So being as transparent as possible and keeping people informed is really important also.
Yeah. And what ways would be like beyond email? How do we do that?
My favorite way to get people informed is to get out there.
Okay.
Like talking. Okay. Stop when you're going to class. Stop when you're doing this.
Okay.
Say announcement in class. Ask for announcements when you get in class and in class. Okay. Things are going on campus, and sometimes people just don't know.
Okay. So just like informal conversations, doing that, right? And I think that's awesome. I always start my class every day with what's happening on campus. What are announcements? Because even on a small campus like this, there's so many cool programming things that students are doing, that staff are doing, the faculty are doing. There's no way I can find out about all that stuff. So giving students and faculty and staff opportunities to come to your space and share that with students is great. Cool. All right, we're like 3 minutes over. I think I have a little bit of leeway for like 3 minutes, but other folks don't. Thank you all so very much. Please take your thing and do it. And talk to people.
One more reminder, if you are trying to get the Mellon practitioners, please sign in.
All right, cool. See you. Have a great day.